My name is Prashant Kumar and I welcome you all in Ethics, Theories and Applications. We are discussing social institution. In the last video, we have discussed and also learned why we really need to understand social institution, why it is so relevant to understand social institution, what are social institutions, and also we tried to look at different characteristics of social institution. We also learned the different accounts of social institutions. So this time let's move further and try to understand the teleological account of institution, and after that we will be learning much about morality and also about justice and how is it related with social institutions. So a teleological account of institution, where teleology is a very important word, and if we try to locate it etymologically, if we try to analyze it etymologically, we find that it comes from the Greek word telos, which means and logos, science. It refers to final purpose, and a theory it explains and justifies values in reference to some final purpose or good. So the central concept in the teleological account of social institution is that of joint action, because if a society has a final goal, if a final purpose, and we all are striving for that final purpose, we really need to work together. And unless and until we don't talk about joint action, we really are not serving the purpose of social institution. So that's why we really need to understand joint action. And joint actions consist of the intentional individual actions of a number of agents directed to the realization of a collective end. I mean, for example, we can think of a table. Suppose if we really need to take table from this place to any other place, we really need to work together. So example of joint action are two people lifting a table together and two men jointly pushing a car. You can think of many examples. Suppose if you are given a course or make a presentation in a group, you may work together, and you all know that how you are going to work together. You distribute your work and come out with the final goal. So collective ends can be implicit in the behavior and attitudes of agents without ceasing to be ends as such. Further, in the case of a collective end pursued over a long period of time, say by members of an institution over generation, the collective end can be latent at a specific point in time. It is not actually being pursued explicitly or implicitly at that point in time. So if we have a collective end of any social institutions, we really need to understand that it can only be realized if we have other small collective purposes. Suppose if we are to do a thing collectively, we can divide those things in smaller parts, and all smaller parts may have a different objective, different goal. At one time it may seem that we are just working for that smaller group or a smaller goal, but at the end we all are working to achieve the collective goal. And that's what he is saying, that it may seem that at one point of time that we are not working for the collective good, but at the end it may come out that we all are working for a collective goal. A further defining feature of organization or social institution is that organizational action typically consists in what has elsewhere been termed a layered structure of joint action. So if we are going to talk about organization, it may have structures, and if it may have structure, it may have different function, and if it may have different function, it implies that we are going to have different duties with different purposes. So in any organization or social institution, each structure comes with different responsibilities, and each responsibility comes with different action. So unless we are not going to join them together, we may not have any organization or social organizations. One illustration of the notion of a layered structure of joint action is an armed force fighting a battle. Suppose at an organizational level, a number of actions are severally necessary and jointly sufficient to achieve some collective end. Collective ends are a species of individual ends, but merely being an end is in itself neither, say, morally good nor morally bad. any more than being an intention or a belief or in themselves morally good or morally bad. So we can always think of the collective good in a moral terms, whether that collective good and collective goal are morally good or bad. So it should also be noted that the social norms governing the roles and role structure of organization are both formal and informal. And with this formal and informal, we can think of descriptive and normative analysis or explanations. Teleological accounts can be either descriptive or normative. For example, slavery is morally objectionable social institution mobilizing physical forces and ideology in the economical interest of the slave owner at the expense of the human rights of the slave. So in the case of many such institutions, the real end of the institution might need to be masked by the ideology if the institution is to survive. Perhaps many asylums are likewise morally objectionable institutions. Each social institution may have morally objectionable traits, or they may not have morally objectionable traits. So if the particular social institution have to survive, they really need to mask it off under any ideology. They may come up certain perks, certain other explanation to justify their own oppression. And we can think of any capitalist society where we see that a person who is working harder and harder gets less money. We can also think of many other objectionable social institutions within a larger social institution, say society, where things are not good. And now we can talk about farmers, we can talk about Asa Bahuwe, we can talk about many other people who are working hard, yet they don't get what they deserve. And that's where we are going to talk about justice. But before we talk about, let's have understanding of descriptive teleological account and a normative teleological account. On a descriptive teleological account, such institution will turn out to be institution, their nature as institution will not be denied. However, in the context of such a descriptive account of institution, the question of their morally objectionable institutional activities ends, and it will not simply rise. Because when we are going to describe about the teleological account, it comes with the process, and with the process we try to explain the final goal of the institution, which is not with the normative teleological account. Now, in normative teleological account, we always have a principle on the basis of which we try to define the action, whether it is morally good or morally bad. So, by the lights of a normative teleological account of social institution, the ends of any given institution to be some social or human good, and there ought to be moral constant on institutional activities. Accordingly, on a normative teleological account, a morally objectionable institution such as slavery will turn out to be defective co-institution. And why we are thinking about slavery as a defective co-institution? Because we all believe, and after French Revolution, we all believe equality, liberty and fraternity. If we are going to have slavery in any social institution, it actually breaks two basic principles, which is liberty and equality. A slave is never considered as equal to other people, say masters. Slavery is a hierarchical institution where slavery or the slaves of an institution do not have any freedom, any liberty. And because of these two things, we cannot have a fraternity. We just cannot consider the other person equal to us, and which implies that we can always demean the other person. And that's why we see that slavery, in most of the cases, master always demean the slaves. So nevertheless, on the normative account, such morally objectionable collectivities are institutions. The normative teleological account needs to be consistent with the descriptive teleological account. So if we are going to have any social institution and it has norms and principle, the descriptive teleological account must follow in order to be coherent. If description of that particular social institution will not have any relation with the normative account, we can always come up with inconsistencies, contradiction, which might lead to the demolition of a particular social system. Normative theory involves arriving at moral standard that regulate right and wrong conduct. In a sense, it is search for an ideal litmus test of proper behavior. So suppose in a society, where there is no principle, there is no guiding force, there is no morality. Think of people doing different actions, and if each person start thinking that his actions are right and the others are wrong, we can see a proper chaos, and in any chaos we cannot conceive of any peaceful coexistence. Therefore, it assumes that we really need to have a standard norms. We need to have a standard moral ground through which we can regulate right and wrong behavior. The golden rule is in normative theory is that we really need to establish a single principle through which we can judge all action, and other normative theories focus on a set of fundamental principles or a set of good character traits. So one can have that, we can come up with a one normative principle, one fundamental principle, and on the basis of that fundamental principle we can come up with a set of fundamental principles which can guide the right and wrong conduct. Normative theories seek to provide action guides, procedures for answering the practical questions. We can frame that practical question in terms of what ought I, or what ought I to do, or what ought we to do. It depends on the standpoint which we all are in. So if I really need to answer this question, then I can think of I ought to do this. I ought to respect the elders. I ought to respect the government. I ought to respect the norms and the cultures of the nation. But at the same time, if we are talking collectively, we can say that we ought not to respect the farmers' law. We ought not to respect the government's demolishing the protesting people. So we can think of in these terms if we are going to have normative theory. The key assumption in normative theory is that there is only one ultimate criterion of moral conduct, whether it is a single rule or a set of principles. There is a relationship between social institution and human rights. So if we have already decided that these are the principles through which we can determine the action of individuals and group, then we need to think about rights and whether these rights have been maintained, preserved or not. So there is a relationship between social institution and human rights. However, there are a range of moral rights that might be termed institutional moral rights. Institutional moral rights in the terms that within an institution we can come up moral rights, and once we go beyond those institutions, those moral rights may not be considered as moral rights. So a particular community may have different moral rules and the other particular community may have a different moral rule. We can always think of Indian society and Western society and Middle East society, and we can see that one particular action which might be good here might be bad there. So in that sense we can think of institutional moral rights. Each institution may have a different moral rights. These are moral rights that depend in part on rights generating properties possessed by human beings, but also in part on membership of community or of a morally legitimate institution or occupancy of a morally legitimate institution rule. So in a particular institution we can think of different people. As we have already talked about authorities in earlier video, we can also talk about morally legitimate institutional people who are authority in any institution. Then they can sublet their duties and they can assign certain people certain responsibility to create norms, to create certain principle through which they can guide or they can determine the actions of a people. So in that sense we can think of different other members in a community. So one can have a simple member of a particular community, then we can have a morally legitimate institutional people who are having certain roles, and then we can think of institution. Within institution these two people get importance as well as responsibilities. Now we need to distinguish between an institutional rights that embody human rights in institutional setting and therefore depend in part on rights generating properties that human beings possess as human beings. These are institutional moral rights, and institutional rights that do not embody human rights in institutional setting. So it's not necessary that each within a particular social institution only humans are going to have rights. There can be other rights through which we can decide. So institutions can have laws which most of the human being cannot have. they may have responsibilities, or they may have the responsibilities to carry out the laws. So institutional rights that do not embody human rights in any institutional setting also becomes quite important. So there are at least two species of institutional rights: individual institutional moral rights and joint moral rights. Joint moral rights, as we have all talked about, that in any society we all live together, and in any society if we all live together, and in order to carry out the desired collective goal, we need to work together. So joint moral rights are moral rights that attach to individual persons but do so jointly. For example, in the context of some institution of property rights, the joint owners of a piece of land might have a joint right, and excluding one would be trespassers. So social institution and distributive justice. So if we are talking about social institution, if we are talking about responsibilities, if we are talking about carrying out the responsibilities, then it becomes quite important to talk about justice in terms of rights. With rights comes the responsibility, and if both are being denied, we really need to talk about justice. So justice is an important aspect of many, if not all, social institutions. Market economies, slavery and wage structures, taxpayers, judicial system, prisons, and so on. And you can think of different social institutions. They all are part to be evaluated in terms of their compliance with principle of justice. So even in market economies, even in your companies, even in your education system, we can all think of justice. So everyone has a right, and if that right has been denied in a particular social institution, we really demand justice. So in order for any social institution to survive, there must be a role of justice. So if there are members of a particular social institution who cannot get justice, they can come out, they can start questioning the social institution, and that might be the first sign of the decline of a particular social institution. Therefore, it becomes quite important for any social institution to have the concept of justice, to have the rules and guidance for justice, and there must be members who can carry out the justice. It is important to distinguish the concept of justice from the related concepts of right, especially a human right, and from goods such as well-being and utility on the other hand. So these are four concepts. We can think of human right, we can think of well-being and utility and justice. So sometimes it happens that a person's well-being doesn't have the concept of justice. So you can think of a particular psycho who kills, and he thinks that he can get better if he kills, but also he denies justice to other people. So we can always think of these certain scenarios where we can distinguish justice from human rights from well-being, and from utility. So well-being is not same as justice. There is a tendency to conflate justice and rights. Arguably, the concepts are distinct, or at least justice in a narrow relational sense should be distinguished from the concept of a right. Genocide, for example, is a violation of human rights, especially the right to life, but it is not necessarily, or at least principally, an act of injustice in a relational sense. Why it cannot be in a relational sense? So suppose if genocide comes within a particular system, particular social institution, where killing on the basis of a certain acts, on a basis of certain rules which are the guiding force in a social institution, it might be considered as the principle which determine what to do and not to do. So it may be, which we generally consider is not right, but it may be one factor that can determine the action of the members of a community. So that's why we can say that it is not necessarily an act of injustice in a relational sense. Relational sense becomes very important. But when we talk about in a collective or a universal sense, in universal sense we go beyond certain things. We try to find out a universal right, which is a right to live. And when we try to judge it from that universal point of view, genocide becomes an immoral and also an act of injustice. So injustice in the relational sense entails unfairness as between persons or group. Injustices in this sense consist in the fact that someone has suffered or benefited but others have not. For if you want to have an example on this, we can think of caste system, where one particular caste gets everything and the other caste do not get answer. So that's how we can see that unfairness towards a group or a particular person, and also we can think of a large group who has been denied many things: education, right to live, dignity, everything. Although the concept of right and the concept of justice are distinct, violations of rights are typically acts of injustices. The concept of justice itself is multi-dimensional. We can think of justice. I mean, there have been people who have discussed about justice. John Rawls is one of the great philosophers who talked a lot about justice in his book, The Theory of Justice. Earlier, Plato has talked about it. So, in this particular video, we might not talk much about the concept of justice, but we are going to talk about in a very brief way. We are going to talk about penal justice and distributive justice. Penal justice, which we can also call retributive justice, where we try to punish the offenders, we try to punish the person who have been involved in any sort of moral or legal offenses, and we distinguish it from distributive justice. In retributive justice, we try to punish the person on the intensity of the crime he has committed. But in distributive justice, where the guilty be punished and the innocent go free. Distributive justice is essentially a relational phenomena to do with the comparative distribution of benefits and burden as between individuals or groups, including the distribution of rights and duties, but not restricted to the distribution of rights and duties. Repeat. Distributive justice is essentially a relational phenomena to do with the comparative distribution of benefits and burdens as between individuals or groups, including the distribution of rights and duties, but not restricted to the distribution of rights and duties. And in order to have distributive justice, we really need to talk about three things. We need to consider all the members are equals, and all the members must be given equal opportunities. And if we are following these two principles, we also need to think of those persons who are getting least in a society. So, in order to provide justice, we need to give the maximum to the least advantages. If we are going to follow these three principles, we can achieve the objective of distributive justice. To distributive justice is an important aspect of most, if not all, social institutions. The role occupants of most institutions, or the members who are having the responsibilities acting as an important member, are the recipients and providers of benefits. For example, wages, consumer products, and the bearers of burdens, allocated tasks, and accordingly are subject to principles of distributive justice. Distributive justice does not appear to be a defining feature and or function of all social institutions. We can also think of communication systems. So even there are injustices, there must be a communication system through which one can talk about the injustices happening in a social system. So communication systems such as human languages are arguably defined in part in terms of the end of the truth, but not in terms of justices. A communicative system would cease to be a communicative system if its participants never attempted to communicate the truth, but not of its participants failed to respect principle of distributive justice. For example, in terms of the number of occasions on which particular speakers were allowed to speak. In any time, if a society or if a social institution needs to survive, the members of that particular society needs to speak the truth whenever they get the opportunity. So unless and until they are not going to speak the truth, there might be certain aspects of injustices which may go hidden. And if they go hidden, there will always be problems, incoherencies, which we really need to address. Unless and until we don't address those issues, a social system, a social institution may not survive or may not work efficiently if it survives. So there is at least one important and uncontroversial principle of distributive justice that arises in the context of collective enterprise, or let's say joint action. Namely that other things being equal, that benefit produced by joint action should flow back to those who perform the joint action. We can think of an example. Let's say that there are members in a factory. If a factory produces much profit, the profit also the profit must also go to the members of that factory, which we generally see that do not go to the people who are involved in an activity. Let us assume that inevitably citizens of a given polity participate in a collective enterprises, whereas this is not necessarily the case for individuals who are not citizens of the same polity. In the contemporary globalizing world, this assumption is increasingly implausible, but let us grant it for the sake of argument. So normally it sees that when we are in a particular society or social institution, we don't think of the other members, or let's say that outside of that social thing. But in this globalizing world where we see that a particular society is engaging with the other society, which has different norms, principles, collective goods, desires, goals, despite this fact, we are communicating with them. We are sharing certain goals, certain principles, certain, let's say that even products. So if we are going to do that, we really need to think of the rights and also the responsibilities of those people who are indirectly or directly participating in the other social institution. Surely this principle of distributive justice, if any, should be enforced by the government in relation to their own citizen, but not in relation to non-citizen. Perhaps at any rate, one key test of this proposition is whether or not individuals would be morally entitled to enforce such a principle of distributive justice in the absence of government. So in any social institutions, if we really need to distribute justice, we really need to have some agency which can distribute. Here we are going to talk about government. So if there are instances of injustices, we can think of whether government should distribute it or not. In most of the cases, government try to hide away from certain responsibilities. But let's say that if the answer is in the affirmative, individuals have a natural right to enforce this principle of distributive justice, then presumably governments have a right to enforce it. After all, as we have seen above, according to liberal democratic theory, individuals relinquish to government whatever pre-existing moral rights to enforcement they might have had. What if we answer it negatively? Does it follow that the government has no moral right to enforce the principle of distributive justice? Not necessarily. For one thing, enforcement of such a principle of distributive justice is not necessarily the violation of a human right. If it were, this would be a moral constraint or government action in this regard. Naturally, the citizens of different societies or polities, or at least their representative governments, might also make a joint decision to enforce this principle of distributive justice in relation to trans-societal joint economic enterprises involving citizens from both politics. So we can see that if two different social institutions are engaging, we can think of the authorities of those two social institutions can come together and can form a common principle that can guide the action of those of both the members of the social institution. So for example, wages in a poor society would need to reflect the contribution of the wage earner to the overall benefits produced by the multinational corporation. And we all know that why we are having an example of multinational corporations, because a company which may have its office in America can also work in India, China and other people, which involve different members of various social institutions. And if the citizens are committed on moral grounds to the enforcement of this principle of distributive justice in relation to intra-societal economical interaction, it is difficult to see why they should not be likewise committed to it in trans-societal economical interactions. So with these things, we have seen that the structure of social institution, we have also talked about the culture of social institution. With this, we also talked about the function of social institution. We have understood different accounts of social institution. And when we are talking about different accounts of social institution, we talk about rights, responsibilities, morality. And then we also talk about the interactions of these different social institution. With this, the lecture gave the formation of social institution through various philosophical theories and their implication in the ethical field. Thank you so much.